the illusion of cages. When we think of crime and punishment today, our minds immediately conjure images of iron bars, concrete cells, and towering walls topped with razor wire. The prison seems like an inevitable, timeless institution. But for centuries in England, the concept of justice was not about cages or cold stone walls. In fact, for the vast majority of human history, locking someone away for years on end was considered a bizarre and entirely impractical waste of resources. Justice in the ancient world was much more immediate. It was about balance. It was about blood. Blood and balance. The era of Wergild. In the early days of Saxon society, if a crime was committed, the law did not seek to lock the offender away. The fragile communities of early medieval England simply could not afford to feed and house a criminal for years. Instead, the law demanded compensation. This was the era of the Wergild, a term that literally translates to man price. Every individual in society had a specific monetary value placed upon their life, dictated entirely by their social standing. If a nobleman was killed, the price was astronomical. If a commoner was struck down, the cost was significantly less. The perpetrator was forced to pay this Wergild directly to the victim's family. It was a brutal, transactional system designed for one specific purpose: to prevent endless, bloody family feuds from tearing the fragile society apart. Justice was simply a matter of debt and payment. If you broke an arm, you paid for the arm. If you took a life, you paid for the life. Stripped of humanity. But this system of financial compensation did not protect everyone. At the very bottom of the social hierarchy were the thralls, the enslaved servants who worked the land and lived at the absolute mercy of their lords. Reflecting the horrific reality of the era, the legal system stripped them of all humanity. The law treated these individuals entirely as property, coldly valuing their lives no more than the livestock in the fields or the hounds in the kennels. If a slave was killed or injured by a rival lord, the Wergild was not paid to their grieving family. It was paid directly to their master, simply to compensate for the loss of a working asset. It was a dark, dehumanizing reality of early English life, where justice was a luxury only the free could afford. Penal slavery and outlawry. But what happened when a free man committed a crime and could not afford to pay his Wergild? In a society built on financial compensation, poverty was a dangerous thing. Those who could not pay their debts were forced into penal slavery. They were stripped of their free status and forced to work off their debt through years of grueling, unpaid labor. For others, the punishment was outright banishment. A criminal could be declared an outlaw. This was not the romanticized Robin Hood-style outlaw of modern movies. To be declared an outlaw meant you were placed entirely outside the protection of the law. You could be hunted, harmed, or killed by anyone without any legal consequence. For an outlaw, the dense, dark forests of England were the only refuge, and starvation or violence was an almost certain fate. 1066. The Norman Influence. Everything changed in the year 1066. With the Norman conquest came a radical shift in how society viewed crime, punishment, and authority. William the Conqueror and his successors brought with them a centralized, iron-fisted approach to rule. They had no interest in local families paying each other off to settle disputes. To the Norman kings, a crime was no longer just a personal offense against an individual. It was a direct offense against the king's peace and the crown itself. The state took absolute control of justice. The old, decentralized courts were replaced by royal courts. Fines that were once paid to grieving families were now paid directly into the king's ever-growing treasury. The justice system became highly profitable for the monarchy. But this created a terrifying new problem for the commoners: the scars of the law. Because the fines were now payable to the king, and because the vast majority of the impoverished population could not afford to pay the crown, the punishments rapidly shifted from financial compensation to brutal physical retribution. The era of the Wergild was officially over. The era of the executioner had begun. The authorities believed that the only way to maintain order among the desperate masses was through absolute terror. Under these brutal new laws, offenders were subjected to severe, life-altering mutilations. It wasn't just about the immediate pain. It was about leaving a permanent, horrifying mark on the criminal for all of society to see. A thief or a forger would carry the physical evidence of their crime for the rest of their days, becoming a walking warning to anyone who might dare to defy the king's law. The human body itself became a canvas for the state's harsh justice. The rise of the jail. Yet despite the omnipresence of physical punishment, a new institution was slowly taking shape in the background: the prison. Originally, these early jails, such as the infamous Newgate in London or the Fleet Prison, were not designed for long-term punishment. They were simply holding pens. They were dark, fortified rooms where the accused were thrown to wait for their trial or to wait for their execution. But as the population grew and the legal system became increasingly bogged down by bureaucracy, men and women found themselves languishing in these stone tombs for months, sometimes years, waiting for a judge to hear their case. The disease pit. For those unfortunate souls left languishing in these early jails, the wait for a judge was often a death sentence in itself. The conditions inside places like Newgate were beyond modern comprehension. These stone-holding pens were entirely devoid of basic sanitation, fresh air, or clean water. Prisoners were crammed together in lightless subterranean dungeons, creating a breeding ground for rampant disease. The most terrifying of these was typhus, known colloquially across the country as jail fever. This highly contagious illness swept through the overcrowded cells with devastating speed. The fever cared nothing for the law or the king's justice, and historical records suggest that this invisible enemy claimed far more lives in the dark corridors of England's prisons than the hangman ever did on the public scaffold. The business of misery. Adding to the physical horrors was a deeply corrupt administrative system. During this era, jailers were not paid a salary by the state. Instead, they ran these prisons like a twisted, profit-driven enterprise. The moment a prisoner crossed the threshold, they were relentlessly extorted. Everything had a price. Inmates were forced to pay an entrance fee, known as a garnish, simply for the privilege of being locked up. They had to pay for their meager rations of bread, for a bundle of dry straw to sleep on, and even to have heavy, rusted iron weights removed from their limbs. For the wealthy, prison could be a reasonably comfortable, albeit restrictive, experience. But for the impoverished masses who could not afford the jailer's fees, they were left to freeze and starve in the deepest, dampest bowels of the prison. The Bridewell Experiment. As the Tudor era dawned, England faced a new crisis. A booming population, coupled with sweeping economic changes, led to a massive surge in poverty and vagrancy. The streets were flooded with the desperate and the displaced. The state's response was a new type of institution, the bridewell, or house of correction. Unlike the traditional jails, which were merely holding pens, the bridewell was designed for active punishment and social control. It targeted the petty offenders, the debtors, and the so-called idle poor. Here the punishment was relentless, exhausting labor. Inmates were forced to beat hemp, spin thread, or walk the grueling treadwheels for hours on end. It was the beginning of a subtle shift in the philosophy of justice, an attempt to physically break the will of the impoverished and mold them into a compliant workforce. The rise of the bloody code. By the time the 17th and 18th centuries arrived, the state's approach to justice had reached a terrifying crescendo. Facing rising crime rates and the threat of social unrest, the government doubled down on the ultimate penalty. This era gave birth to what became notoriously known as the Bloody Code. The law books exploded with capital offenses. Eventually, over 200 different crimes carried the sentence of absolute doom. The legal system placed an astonishingly high value on property, often prioritizing it far above human life. Stealing a sheep, cutting down a young tree, or pickpocketing goods worth more than a mere shilling could all lead a person to a grim, inescapable fate. The authorities believed that only the threat of ultimate destruction could keep the desperate masses in line. The spectacle of the scaffold. Under the Bloody Code, executions evolved into massive public spectacles. At infamous sites like Tyburn in London, the state orchestrated these events to be as theatrical and highly visible as possible. Crowds numbering in the tens of thousands would gather on hanging days, transforming a solemn act of justice into a chaotic, carnival-like atmosphere. The authorities wanted the public to watch, to fear, and to obey. Yet the deep irony of the Bloody Code was playing out right beneath the gallows. As the crowd stared upward, distracted by the grim theater, local pickpockets seamlessly worked through the throng, committing the very same capital offenses that were being punished above them. The grand strategy of deterrence was fundamentally failing. The winds of reform. By the late 1700s, the English justice system was buckling under its own catastrophic weight. The prisons were overflowing, rotting from the inside out, and the public was growing increasingly numb to the endless cycle of the Bloody Code. It was during this dark period that reformers like John Howard began to step into the lightless dungeons. Howard traveled relentlessly, inspecting the horrific conditions of these early jails and exposing the grim reality to a shocked public. The realization slowly dawned on the authorities that ruling entirely through physical terror and neglect was not creating a safer society. The era of the public spectacle was beginning to crack, paving the way for a radical, unprecedented shift in how the world would handle its criminals. The escalation of capital crimes. By the 18th century, the number of offenses technically punishable by the ultimate penalty had exploded. After 1688, Parliament, now firmly in control of lawmaking, could create new capital felonies with alarming ease. Ambitious politicians often pushed for harsher laws, sometimes out of self-interest or simply a desire to appear uncompromising in crime. On paper, more than 200 different offenses could lead to a final, fatal trip to the gallows. But in practice, the system had stretched itself too thin. Ordinary people, though entirely accustomed to rough justice, saw many of these punishments as completely disproportionate. Juries and witnesses frequently hesitated to even participate in trials if a minor theft might end a life. In London, the ultimate sentence was really only applied to around 25 main offences, and across the whole of England, no more than about 30 crimes commonly led to an execution. Yet the shadow of the scaffold still loomed large. A stark, heartbreaking example comes from a report in the Times on the 18th of January, 1801. It describes Andrew Branning, a boy of just 13 years old, accused of breaking into a house and stealing a spoon. While others involved managed to escape into the night, young Andrew was caught and brought to trial. The verdict handed down was chillingly routine for the era. Guilty, death. The business of extortion. For those who were not executed or transported across the oceans, life behind prison walls brought a completely different kind of ordeal. Positions such as warder, keeper, or assistant jailer were not noble civil service jobs. They were often obtained through outright purchase or handed out as political favors. Once in control, many of these officials treated their posts as a personal business, using their absolute authority to extract money from prisoners at every conceivable opportunity. These jailers grew hardened by constant exposure to suffering. In many places, they were perfectly willing to use harsh methods, echoes of brutal medieval times, to force the payment of fees. Heavy irons could be clamped onto a prisoner until they could scrounge up the coin to have them removed or lightened. Corporal punishment was devastatingly common, delivered with whatever tools lay close to hand. Prisoners might be confined in dark, damp cells, sometimes even locked in areas where the deceased had not yet been moved. Isolation and deliberate underfeeding were standard tools of the trade, and these horrific conditions created the perfect storm for diseases like jail fever and smallpox to tear through the population. In reality, a prisoner's survival often depended just as much on the whims and greed of the guards as it did on the official sentence of the court. Even the most basic human necessities could be monetized. Cells and daily rations assigned to inmates might be sold off to the highest bidder, while guards made extra profit by smuggling in forbidden goods like spirits and tobacco. New arrivals faced a terrifying hazing ritual known as chummage or garnish, a sum of money forcefully demanded by their fellow prisoners. Those who could not pay were sometimes stripped of their very clothing, an act grimly referred to in the underworld as letting the black dog walk. A flawed system of correction. Many early prisons and houses of correction completely failed to live up to their stated purpose. In theory, they were meant to reform offenders through hard, honest work. In reality, a vast number of these institutions offered only the most basic, mind-numbing tasks. Historical records suggest that more than 70 such establishments provided little to no genuine employment, leaving inmates entirely idle or engaged in pointless busy work that did absolutely nothing to change the trajectory of their lives. Yet despite all of this corruption and decay, these older jails were not entirely devoid of human feeling. Alongside the cruelty of the officials and the unforgiving harshness of the regime, there were profound moments of generosity and solidarity between the prisoners themselves. Newcomers might be mocked or bullied for their garnish, but they also frequently received help, shared food and guidance from those who shared their grim fate. Prisoners were heavily shackled and often dressed in mere rags, but they still retained traces of their own individuality. Unlike in the centuries that followed, They were not yet forced into identical state-issued uniforms designed to psychologically erase their identities. And although the physical conditions were incredibly filthy and unhealthy, many of these earlier jails were, in some strange respects, less systematically oppressive than the stark, rigidly regimented prisons that would soon rise. The suffering was intensely real, but the full, terrifying machinery of modern imprisonment had not yet fully taken shape. The transportation escape hatch. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the English authorities were caught in a trap of their own making. The Bloody Code had created a legal landscape where hundreds of crimes technically carried the ultimate penalty, yet judges and juries were increasingly reluctant to condemn offenders for relatively minor property offenses. The result was a crisis of overcrowding. Prisons, which had never been designed for long-term incarceration, were packed with men, women, and even children awaiting their fate. To relieve the pressure, the state embraced a grim alternative: transportation. Instead of facing the gallows, many convicts were sentenced to be shipped across the ocean to distant colonies. At first, they were sent to North America. Later, enormous numbers were transported to Australia. For the authorities, the solution served several purposes at once. It removed unwanted individuals from society. It provided cheap labor for colonial expansion. And it allowed judges to appear merciful without truly relaxing the grip of the law. For the transported, however, it was a punishment that combined exile, forced labor, and permanent separation from home. Many would never see England again. Their sentence did not end at the dock. It was written into the rest of their lives. Prisons at breaking point. Even with transportation, the situation at home remained dire. Old jails, some of which dated back to medieval times, were buckling under the strain. Built as temporary holding facilities, they were now stuffed with long-term prisoners. Filth, overcrowding, and the ever-present threat of disease remained endemic. Reformers continued to push for change. The work of figures like John Howard and Elizabeth Fry brought the suffering of prisoners to public attention. They did not simply call for compassion. They argued that a chaotic, disease-ridden, corrupt prison system could not possibly achieve its stated goal of reform. If the state truly wanted to change offenders, it needed something entirely new, a system built from the ground up to control every aspect of a prisoner's life. Out of this pressure, the modern penitentiary was born. The new age of the penitentiary. In the early 19th century, a revolutionary idea began to take hold in Britain and beyond. Instead of focusing primarily on the body through whipping, mutilation, or public execution, the authorities would now turn their attention to the mind. Crime, they argued, was the product of moral failure. Therefore, the solution was not just physical suffering, but moral reconstruction. The new penitentiaries were carefully designed to enforce order, discipline, and constant supervision. They featured wings of identical cells radiating from central observation points, an architectural style that allowed a small number of guards to monitor many prisoners at once. The most famous theorist of this approach was the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who proposed the panopticon, a circular prison where inmates could be watched at any time, but never knew when they were being observed. Even when no one was looking, they would behave as though they were. Although Bentham's perfect panopticon was never fully realized, its principles deeply influenced real prison design. The message was clear. In this new world, You would not simply be punished. You would be watched, shaped, and controlled. The silent and separate systems. Alongside the new architecture came two powerful and disturbing regimes, the silent system and the separate system. Under the silent system, prisoners worked and moved together, but were strictly forbidden from speaking. Hard labor was combined with an almost total ban on human communication. Silence itself became a tool of punishment and control. The authorities believed that by cutting inmates off from conversation, and therefore from criminal influence, they could break old habits and instill discipline. The separate system went even further. In these prisons, such as the model establishment at Pentonville in London, each prisoner was kept alone in a small cell for almost the entire day. They ate, slept, and worked in isolation, often performing monotonous tasks like picking oakum or weaving. When they were allowed out, for chapel or brief exercise, they wore hoods or masks to prevent them from recognizing others. The goal was to force the prisoner into deep reflection and repentance, stripped of all distractions. On paper, this was presented as humane and progressive. In practice, it could be psychologically devastating. Many inmates subjected to prolonged separation experienced severe mental distress. Some broke down entirely under the strain of silence and solitude. The authorities had discovered a new frontier of punishment, not the destruction of the body, but the quiet erosion of the self. Uniformity and the loss of identity. The rise of the Victorian penitentiary also marked the end of the ragged individuality that had once existed in older jails. Prisoners were now dressed in identical uniforms, their hair cut to regulation length, their movements governed by a relentless timetable. Every aspect of life was measured and controlled: waking, work, meals, prayers, and sleep. Number replaced name. Personal histories, however tragic or complex, were flattened into a set of records and regulations. Where past prisons had been chaotic and often lethal, they had at least allowed space for small acts of humanity and camaraderie between inmates. The new system traded some of that physical chaos for something colder, a machine of discipline, in which each prisoner was just one more interchangeable part. To Victorian reformers, this was progress. To many who lived through it, it felt like a new kind of cage, the long shadow of reform. By the late 19th century, public executions were finally abolished in Britain. Punishment retreated from the open air into the hidden interior of the prison walls. The bloody code was gradually dismantled, transportation ended, and the number of capital crimes was vastly reduced. On the surface, it seemed as though society was becoming more humane. Yet the story is far more complex. The scaffold may have disappeared from public squares, but the power of the state over the lives and bodies of its citizens did not fade. It changed shape. The focused terror of the noose was replaced by the slow grinding pressure of long-term imprisonment. Instead of a single dramatic moment, punishment became a drawn-out presence, measured in years and decades. Modern prisons, with their secure perimeters, surveillance systems, and highly structured routines, are the direct descendants of those Victorian experiments in silence and separation. The language has softened. The architecture has evolved. The legal codes have grown thicker and more technical. But at the core lies the same question that has haunted every age. What is justice? From the Wergild of the Saxons to the iron discipline of the Victorian penitentiary, the history of crime and punishment in England is not a straight line from brutality to kindness. It is a series of attempts, sometimes clumsy, sometimes cruel, to answer an impossible question. How do you protect society, acknowledge harm, and still recognize the humanity of the person who has done wrong? Early medieval law tried to solve it with money and compensation. The Norman kings answered with fear and blood. The Georgian lawmakers trusted in the spectacle of the scaffold and the terror of the bloody code. The Victorians placed their faith in silence, solitude, and the architecture of control. Today the debate continues. Are prisons places of punishment, protection, or genuine rehabilitation? Do they make society safer, or do they quietly perpetuate the very problems they claim to solve? When we lock someone away, are we defending justice or simply hiding our failures? As we look back across 1,000 years of cages, chains, and cells, one thing becomes painfully clear. The question of how to deal with crime has never really been settled. It has only changed costume. And the next chapter in this story is still being written.